Dissociative disorders. I'm going to try and buzz through this one pretty quickly. Cross my fingers. These are very interesting disorders, but actually happen very rarely. So, in terms of actually helping people, this is not necessarily the most effective one to spend a ton of time on. Now, we're grouping this together with our stress disorders because frequently, um, most frequently, there is a connection that there is some sort of dissociation due to some traumatic event. Now, when I say dissociation, that is just a word that means to separate from oneself, right? There is some break in either memory or personality that is separated from the rest of the person's identity and thought. The two that we're going to talk most about are dissociative amnesia and dissociative identity disorder, uh, which was previously known as multiple identity disorder. And we'll talk about both of these. Now, dissociative amnesia is the inability to recall your own personal information. And this isn't like it happens in movies, right? It's not because somebody got knocked on the head and they wake up in the hospital and they're like, "Who are you? Who am I?" Right? That can happen. Very rare cases, but it does happen. Um, we're talking about some loss of identifying information based on no physical cause, right? There's no brain trauma that's occurred. There is simply some event. Usually, people with dissociative amnesia experience it because there is something that they would like to forget. And it's not that they're like, "Oh, I don't want to remember that." Deleted, right? That's not. It's not conscious, right? It is that the trauma is severe enough that, in order to protect itself, the brain works its way around it, eliminates it in some way, so that the person doesn't have to deal with it, right? Um, Generally speaking, this isn't just, "Oh, I forgot to pay my bills because my bills stress me out." It has to be something a little bit more traumatic than that, and it needs to be a level of "I don't remember enough," and that it's causing me problems, right? It's causing distress and dysfunction. Um, and it can't also, once again, the memory loss can't be caused by drugs, which can also occur. In comparison, dissociative identity disorder is when the person develops more than one personality that they then switch between. And this may also then lead to episodes of memory loss or forgetfulness, where if the other personality is active, a person may not be aware of what happened while they were not the primary personality that was active. Once again, as you can imagine, this can lead to distress and dysfunction, um, and it needs to be something that is not caused because of some medical condition or drug, right? You got different types of dissociative amnesia. Localized is when you lose all memory for all everything that happened within a span of time, right? Um, and that's the most common type, right? I don't remember anything in the last 2 weeks. Don't know what happened, right? Selective is when you forget some of the things, but not all of the things in that period. Generalized is broader, right? It's not just I don't remember what happened during this time period, but I don't remember a long time period, and that may also be include some autobiographical information. I don't remember everything about myself. I don't remember who you are, etc., etc. And then continuous amnesia is when you continue to fail to create new memories. That's very rare in dissociative amnesia cases, but it can occur. Frequently, along with dissociative amnesia, you will get episodes of what we call dissociative fugue or flight, running away. Um, there was a pretty well publicized occurrence 5 years ago, 10 years ago, that was reported in the news where a young man went on local news and said, "Hey, my fiance is missing. Please, everybody, keep your eye out for her." And of course, everybody's first thought was, well, the fiance killer, right? It was the dude. It's always the dude. It wasn't in this case, although he was investigated and then later cleared. Nobody knew what had happened to her. She was just gone, disappeared until 2 months later. She called from halfway across the nation. She found herself in Texas, and she called her fiance from a phone booth and said, I'm in Texas, and I don't know how I got here. Can you come pick me up? Right? And so he did, and she went back home, and to the best of my knowledge, things turned out fine. High levels of stress can cause not just these dissociative states where I forget what's going on and who I am and what's happening, but also even where I am and I go someplace else. This can last for a few hours, a few days, a few weeks. In this case, it was a couple of months. She had apparently been calling herself by a different name, and then gradually just came back to herself. She says that she was quite stressed out about the idea of getting married, but couldn't identify anything beyond that. So what exactly was going on there? I didn't follow the story long enough to really figure that out, but definitely an example of dissociative fugue. Talking about the suppression of traumatic memories, there was a real spate of cases starting probably in the 70s or 80s and up through about 2000 or maybe 2010, of folks suddenly remembering trauma that had occurred to them early in life. A lot of those claims then were used not a lot, a handful of those claims were then used in court, used to put people in jail because of sexual abuse that had occurred. And, dads and uncles and whatever ended up going to jail for sexual abuse. And at least a couple of these cases, the person later recanted, right, and said, I thought I remembered that, but I was actually wrong. And that never happened. And so what is that about? Well, it helps to understand a little bit about memory. We don't store video copies of our memory like you do on your computer, right? There is some, you download a movie from iTunes, and there is an actual copy of that film on your hard drive in a particular location, right? Where you can double click on the file and it opens up and then it plays, right? It's all right there. We don't store memories that way. We break our memories down when we are storing them into our memory, into their component parts, and one part of the cortex of my brain will contain my emotional state regarding a particular memory, and another part of my brain will store the information about who was present, and another part of my brain will store the information about what was said. And when I want to remember something, I then I grab all of those pieces and I jigsaw them back together to remember what happened. This process is famously prone to error. You can introduce all sorts of errors into memory. In fact, there was a news, or maybe it was a podcast. One of my podcasts that I like to listen to, Revisionist History, I think it was. They had an episode about people's memories of 9/11, where people tend to have very strong memories of what happened to them on that day if they're of a particular age, my age or so. But then the guy went back to fact check what the stories that people were telling, and in many cases, they were wrong, right? The paper trail that they could find for that person did not match what they remembered for themselves of that day. Because as you reconstruct that memory, tell that story, you can introduce errors into it. Unintentionally, not meaning to, with the best of intentions, right? This can occur. This suggestibility, and this has been experimentally manipulated as well, where you bring people in, show them something, have them create a memory of it, right, just by showing them the thing, and then ask them leading questions that get them to introduce features into that memory that weren't there in the first place. And it works with most people. So under the right conditions, you can remember something that may not have occurred. So for instance, I have a memory. I'm the youngest of 5 boys in my family growing up. I have a strong memory of my brothers putting me in a trash bag, tying it closed, and leaving me out by the side of the road as the trash collector was coming down the street. I had to like poke my way through the bag and like climb out of it and run back in the house. My brothers swear this never happened. They would. But at this point, I'm not sure that it happened either. Like, it may have been a dream. It may have been that there was some other game that they were playing with me where they were sort of being mean to me, and I put that together with some other information in my head, and that's what I ended up with. It may also be that they're just big fat liars. But there is the possibility, the strong possibility, that I remember something that didn't actually happen. And I'm never going to be sure. And it really bugs me. As a result of the fallibility of memory, a lot of this recovered memory stuff is no longer admissible in court. Not because every single instance of recovered trauma is false. I don't want to suggest that. I do think that there are people who repress their own memories because they're too painful to deal with, and then later it comes back up to the surface, and that's actually something that happened. I would never wish to suggest otherwise. However, in legal contexts, that's not admissible information unless there's other evidence that can support it, because memory is too famously faulty at this point for that to be something that can be used. Okay, let's talk about DID. This is when you get 2 or more personalities, or subpersonalities as they're more officially called, each with their own personality, each with their own characteristic ways of behaving, speaking, moving, talking, thinking. This then comes about due to, as best as we can tell, exposure to trauma, high levels of stress, and people tend to develop subpersonalities that are designed to take care of particular parts of their lives, right? So you may have one personality that develops to handle your academic life, and another one to handle your romantic life, and another one to handle your family life. And this is much more common in women than it is amongst men. And you usually get more than just a couple personalities. Usually there's right around 10 or so. There's more, once again, for women than for men on average. And what those the interaction between those subpersonalities can differ. Frequently, they are unaware of each other. So if one of my alternate personalities is active, my primary personality, which from a clinical perspective is simply the person who shows up asking for help in the office, that's treated as the dominant personality, the primary personality. If you've got mutually amnesic relationships, then these alternates are not aware of each other, right? You come to and you don't know what's happened for the last 6 hours. And that can be really scary. There are other ways that can work, though. I have heard of at least a couple of individuals, a couple of case studies where the alternate personalities were aware of each other. The subpersonalities would actually get together and meet in the person's mind and discuss with each other. And then you may get some that are not aware of others while the primary personality is aware of the alternates. So it can work in any one of those ways. You get sort of impossible differences between these personalities in terms of accent and knowledge sets and different ways of moving. Even your gait, how you walk can change, and it really goes beyond the level of this is just somebody trying to fool you and putting on an act. This is truly different personalities within the same individual. This was thought to be very rare. In recent years, there have been more reports of DID occurring, but we're still talking about, several thousand cases reported in the United States and Canada over the last several decades. Which, yeah, that's not nothing, but it's still very, very low rates of occurrence. Um, and it's low enough that there are plenty of clinicians and researchers who don't believe that this deserves to be its own uh, category of disorder, but rather believes that this is simply a subtype of PTSD, that you get folks dealing with high levels of trauma who then, in order to deal with that, create new personalities for themselves, but that it does not deserve to be its own diagnosis. As we said, memory is something that we study a lot, and I could spend a ton of time talking about all of these things, but um, I want to focus in on just these dissociative disorders. Why does this happen? Well, um, you've got competing explanations for why this occurs. One of the primary ones is a psychodynamic perspective. Freud, remember, he says that we've got our subconscious mind, and anything that we don't like, we just shove in there. So if you've got somebody who dealt with high levels of trauma, and in case I haven't said it already, nearly everyone who develops DID and is diagnosed with DID has a history of severe childhood trauma. Um, so the psychodynamic perspective just says, well, this is just the result of repression. You've got so much being repressed that the person can't even remember certain aspects of things that they have done, and in order to explain that to themselves, then they create these personalities, right? And so if you live your life that way with excessive repression, then you get these whole personalities that then surge to the surface unexpectedly. Um, so this says that it is due to the trauma. There is something to be said about that. However, only a very, very small subset of kids who go through traumatic events develop DID, so there's got to be something more than just that going on. So cognitive behavioral perspective says that then dissociation occurs in response to operant conditioning, right? If it works out well for you to not remember something, you are likely to do that again. And over time, that can become a response set where, under certain conditions, you simply do not recall the things that are stressful or traumatic, and that can develop and cause this schism in the self and this creation of a new personality. However, this can only explain some of the characteristics of DID and not necessarily all of them. And that's true of pretty much all of these explanations. State-dependent learning, there is some research that suggests that you remember things best when you try to recall them under the same conditions that you learned them in. And so you can see how that might be associated with a separation of the self, and how certain events might be associated with a particular type of response, and other more normal events are associated with a different kind of response, and so that eventually creates a split. Again, it's not a terribly satisfying explanation, but there are some researchers who feel like it's this state-dependent learning that is causing this. How do we treat it? Oh, no, this is another explanation for why it occurs. Self-hypnosis, right? You are convincing yourself, suggesting to yourself that you have another personality, and therefore it exists. This is also what we call response set theory. I expect this to occur, and therefore I behave as if it has occurred. That's a little too much of a pointing the finger at the person with the disorder, in my opinion. You're doing this to yourself. And so I'm not sure what to say about that. But there are some who suggest that that is what is going on. What do we do to help people? From the psychodynamic perspective, it's all about bringing the unconscious back into the conscious, right? Interpreting the person's dreams and their free association responses in order to figure out what is boiling below the surface, and then making the person aware of that so that they can then reintegrate those memories that they've repressed, and that there ceases to be a need for alternate personalities to deal with particular situations. the treatments for DID have not been super successful, generally speaking, and so this is still something we're trying to get hang of. We're still not sure what's going on with the disorder, so it's pretty hard to treat. And the success rates are fairly low. The occurrence rates are low enough that most therapists will go their entire careers without ever encountering a single occurrence of DID. And so knowing exactly how to treat it is pretty difficult because you don't have enough recorded cases with good evidence to really develop effective treatments for it. Okay, that's all we're saying about that one. That's it for this chapter, and I will try and have our next chapter up in the next couple of days. Thanks, everybody. Talk to you soon.